The announcement of Final Fantasy XVI put a small wrench in my plans to rank various themes across the series, since I would like to be able to rank every game. It did, however, grant me an opportunity to now talk about the logos in the FF franchise. I am a massive fan of Yoshitaka Amano's artwork, and even though there is only one logo he didn't design, this is the perfect time to dive into his mastercraft. The logo is the initial opportunity to see into the soul of the game. So today, I'm going to rank the logos based on the artwork itself, the significance to its respective game, and just my personal preference. I am only counting the main series, without various sequels or expansions to the MMOs. Let's do this. Number 16, Final Fantasy VII. If you're still here, I typically do prefer these simple logos, as you will see as the list goes on. However, this is my least favorite of the bunch. The logo, of course, represents Meteor, the impending threat to Final Fantasy VII's plot. Thematically, it was a great choice. In terms of showing off Amano's skill and style, I think this is where it lacks for me. I don't hate it, but I am indifferent about it. It's worth noting that he drew dozens of mock-ups for this logo, not even feeling sure if it was good or not. But finally, other staff members were the ones that decided on what you see as the final logo for the game. The green meteor represents the central element of Mako energy, so I think they made the right choice. Number 15, Final Fantasy XV. With the early announcement of Final Fantasy Versus 13, then to the transition of Final Fantasy 15, the logo remained intact. I never knew before, but the shape of this logo was made to be like a shut eye, tying in with the Somnus theme in the game. You see the Oracle asleep with the light of the presumed moon behind her. It's also neat to see Leviathan hiding out on the left side as well. You may be asking yourself why I have this logo so low on the list. Well, my answer is that I don't really think this best represents the heart and soul of Final Fantasy XV. It may have for Versus, but I think the revised ending logo is much better for this one. Seeing Noctis on his throne tops off the coming-of-age direction of the narrative. How interesting is it to see that the old logo represents the old project in its infant stage, while the final logo, you see the infant grown into the king he would become. Number 14, Final Fantasy X. It's funny, the logo for Final Fantasy X actually represents one of my favorite moments from the game's narrative. The Killik ascending and the sending in the finale are the instances that possibly make me reflect the most on the themes of the game. That being said, I don't dislike this logo at all. I actually do like it. I just like most of the other logos more. It was the first time that the logo was not centered within the words Final and Fantasy. But that's okay. You can also see Yoshitaka Amano's signature at the bottom right, another first for the series. FF10 actually had a different logo originally, in which I probably like a little bit more than the official choice. Number 13, Final Fantasy XIV. How could you not love FF14's logo? You see a huge party of Warriors of Light ready to take on anything thrown at them. This may not necessarily be the most thematic, but that's fine. Final Fantasy XIV is just an awesome experience to share with others, and ultimately, that's all that was needed to be represented here. As you move your eyes around the edges, you get to try and figure out which job class represents each character. The attention to detail on the weapons is probably my favorite element of 14's logo. That and the beautiful variety of colors used in its original form. And yes, I do prefer the original logo to the fully blue version in A Realm Reborn. The most glaring critique is the placement of the image respective to the title, but it's unique. Number 12, Final Fantasy IV. FF4 may be the most important and historic logo in the series. This was the first time that the original release had the standard font and central Amano piece that became a staple for the series. Before this, in FF1, 2, and 3, the logos and font were still in sync with each other, but ultimately it was changed for FF4, and for the better if you ask me. The original logo was simple. It was the vulnerable Dragoon Kain in a casual yet iconic stance. Even though Kain may not be the central character in 4, it works well enough since Final Fantasy IV's main development vision was to give deeper characterization to the cast. Kain's story is legendary and has arguably made him the most memorable character in the game. The DS remake changed the logo to Golbez. Apparently, Amano really likes the latter version, and it's interesting to see that it ties in well with the original. Golbez has a strong grip on Kain throughout the entire story. Number 11, Final Fantasy VI. FF6's logo is yet another that is very memorable to Yoshitaka Amano, for two distinct reasons. Terra was one of the first main characters in the series to be female, and the illustration was designed to be a silhouette, which is also my favorite aspect of the piece. I don't think I could come up with a better logo for Final Fantasy VI. I think I speak for everyone when I say that the enchantment begins once you see the Magitech armors trekking across the snow to the winter mining town Narsh. Much of the promotional artwork for the game contains Yoshitaka Amano's art of Terra and the Magitech. The black and red coloring together help prepare the player for the darkest FF game to date at the time. There was a distinct and clear vision for Final Fantasy VI, truly a stellar logo. Number 10, Final Fantasy XIII. This one stands out to me for multiple reasons. First off, Yoshitaka Amano's illustration actually influenced the ending of the game, which I feel is neat. Most important of all though, this felt like the first time in the series that the logo had mystery behind it. Instead of directly seeing the main character, or the symbol representing the main plot point of the game, the player is trying to put together the meaning deep within. That's one of the many ways I feel FF13 is underrated. I don't necessarily want to spoil what the logo is because it is the end of the story, but I will conclude with pointing out the main text of the title being outlined to coincide with the color of the logo. It was a nice touch. Number 9, Final Fantasy IX. Ironically, this is the only logo not designed by Yoshitaka Amano. He did create some sketches and concept art for the logo, but the finalized version is not his. This is arguably the simplest of the bunch, but it means a lot to me. The marketing for Final Fantasy IX focused heavy on the return of the crystals. This filled me with so much joy as a kid, because I did grow up playing the classics, heavily based around crystals and true fantasy. While the art itself is nothing special, the meaning of this one is of most importance. Number 8, Final Fantasy V. I've always found this to be a unique logo. FF1 through 4 all had a character represented in each piece. FF5 switches things up and uses the Windrake instead. To me, this is also the first time the logo takes a thematic approach. When things in the game point to the importance of a dragon, even the ending theme is a rework of the classic track, The Dragon Spreads Its Wings. In fact, Hironobu Sakaguchi says this about FF5's development. With Final Fantasy V, Yoshinori Kitase and I tried to change Final Fantasy and didn't hold back on our ideas. Even if we emptied ourselves, we'd pour out as many ideas as we could the next time around and change everything. So yes, I believe in every aspect of development, the artwork, the music, the story, and the gameplay itself, behind the scenes, or the team spreading their wings. Number 7, Final Fantasy VIII. This is the point where we've hit my top tier of the logos. Final Fantasy VIII is an incredibly special experience to me. This logo has the game's main protagonist, Squall, embracing the female lead, Renoa, and their scene at the Sorceress Memorial Building. This is one of the best payoff scenes in the game and series for me. A man who had adopted his duty to hide from the demons inside finally finds someone else to live for. The artwork is truly touching in this one. The orange and yellow is there to convey the sunlight behind them, similar to the opening cutscene. The development team knew this would be a big moment and directly asked Yoshitaka Amano to create this logo. Perfect choice. Number 6, Final Fantasy XII. The creation of FF12's logo has a rather interesting story. Amano had drawn a separate logo for this up until the final hour before meeting with representatives from Square to look at his design. This logo you see was created with a watercolor-like ink and spontaneous brush effects. These brush effects, Amano explained, can only happen spontaneously and are not often requested. In my opinion, it's an incredible logo, huge, but incredible. Gabranth is not only my favorite character in Final Fantasy XII, but one of my favorites in the series. His pose here coincides with an identical pose in the final dungeon of the game. It's not necessarily thematic, but when you reach that scene of the game, it instantly clicks where it came from. Amano's artwork of the other judges is also quite soulful and excellent. Number 5, Final Fantasy XVI. I have to tell you, I love this logo. I think it's the best logo Final Fantasy has had in the past 15 years. For the original main series titles anyway. If we're counting Shadowbringers or Final Fantasy Origin, then that's another story. The trailer built up an epic narrative in the battle between the dueling icons of fire, Phoenix and Ifrit. We don't yet know if this is a literal logo or if their battle has deeper themes contained within. Regardless, Yoshitaka Amano's usage of color and 3D effects are what sell this one for me. The purple and orange go great together. I'm not one who believes in hype culture, but this logo does add to my excitement for the next entry in the Final Fantasy saga. Number 4, Final Fantasy XI. Apparently, this was the most tedious and challenging logo for Amano to illustrate. As you can see, there are a vast amount of characters he had to draw, each differing in job class and race. He said that he had to use a giant sheet of paper to perfect the required detail. I love this logo for many reasons. It feels deeply connected with the logo for Final Fantasy I, which we will get to. That logo has the Warrior of Light colored in blue. FF11 has an entire army of Warriors of Light, bringing back the classic element we had not seen in years, but also ushering the next era of the franchise. Hironobu Sakaguchi was adamant that an online revolution was coming, thus giving birth to Final Fantasy XI being an MMORPG and uniting our world within the world of Vana'diel. This logo simply is us. Number 3, Final Fantasy III. The hardest part of this list for me are the 3 remaining logos. I love each of these enough to alternate the order at any given minute. They all have something in common as well. Each of them were created years later for their respective remakes, but based off of classic Amano pieces from the originals. FF3's logo is of course of the Warrior of Light holding 2 different blades. I take a couple of insights from this. First, it perfectly highlights the joy of the battle system. FF3's multi-hit system, especially with dual wielding, is so satisfying and underrated. Second, and most important, I like to think that the warrior is making use of both a light sword and a dark sword, creating balance between the two, and finding the true way to end the tilting cycles. Number 2, Final Fantasy I. As simple and iconic as needed for a solid FF logo. The Warrior of Light is the poster child for what Final Fantasy means to me. What is it about Amano's art that communicates something deeper to the viewer? Deeper than just a drawing or just a character. This and FF2 also received even newer logos on the PSP releases years later. I love them both and would place either of them in the spot. The blue coloring has always made me think of the radiance of the crystals illuminating the Warriors of Light as they slowly renew balance to the elements. I could be thinking too deeply about it, but it makes sense to me. A perfect logo, so how could another be on top? Number 1, Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy II is underappreciated in virtually every way. I said before that I mostly prefer the simple logos. Think back on every logo in the series. How many times did the villain take the spotlight? Without counting the 3D remake of FF4, the answer is twice, FF2 and FF12. And FF12's Gabranth is debatable at that. So let's give Final Fantasy II the definitive credit of being the only game to have the villain and the spotlight within its own title. The Emperor is one that has eluded villainous acclaim, which is simply abhorrent. One of the darkest Final Fantasy games, illuminated in bright pink, is ironic, but breathes so much character into this game. I'm guessing the pink comes from the Final Dungeon's color scheme, in the remake anyway. For those who don't know, this dungeon is also supposed to be Hell. Hell is pink, and it somehow completely works. If you take away anything from this video, make it deeper appreciation for the Emperor and Final Fantasy II.